They thought he was just another old man on a bench 93 years worn. Cane at his side, dog tag glinting faintly in the morning sun. Even the cop who stopped saw only Frailty, laughing as she wrote him off. But then he spoke just 5 quiet words. Then the entire street seemed to freeze. What could an old veteran say that would silence an officer, draw a crowd, and change how a whole town remembered him? This is not just a story of age, but of memory, respect, and the weight carried in silence. Would you have stepped back? The town began in modest light. The kind that doesn't argue with shadows, but lets them linger a while longer across brick and pavement. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters with the steady rhythm of practiced arms. Each clatter a punctuation mark on streets not yet busy. A bus rolled up to the corner, air brakes sighing like an old man leaning into a chair. Commuters stepped off and disappeared into doorways, leaving the vehicle to exhale and gather again. A patrol car idled by the curb, engine humming without hurry. Lights not yet asked to flash. On the bench outside the post office, a figure sat wrapped in quiet routine. 93 years had worn the man, but had not hurried him. A wool cap covered thinning hair, its edge pulled low against a morning that had not chosen warmth. His coat was buttoned with precision, the kind of habit drilled long before fashion or comfort dictated choice. In his lap lay a folded newspaper, yesterday's issue, its creases worn along lines he had folded many times before. The pages might have been old, but their order was intact. He opened and closed them carefully, his thumb tracing columns as though each word still mattered. At his knee rested a cane, smooth along its grip, where years of touch had polished the wood to a sheen. It leaned just enough to remind him it was part of the day's equipment. Neither friend nor burden, only present. Around his neck, beneath the plain shirt he wore without ornament, hung a chain. Against fabric cooled by the morning air, a single dog tag rested. The letters pressed decades ago, still legible if one leaned close enough. He did not touch it often, but its weight had learned to balance his posture. As steady as the bench beneath him, a delivery truck backed into the alley behind the hardware store. The beep, steady and indifferent. Across the street, the barber propped his door open with a brick, letting in air that smelled faintly of rain, still considering its arrival. In the window of the diner, steam-clouded glass, where a cook leaned on the grill, spatula at the ready. The whole town behaved like a room preparing for company. Ordinary steps repeated until they no longer needed thought. The old man lifted the newspaper again, not to read headlines but to check the crease he had trusted for years. He smoothed it flat across his lap, then folded it once more with care. His fingers, bent by time but still precise, pressed the line until paper remembered its place. A boy might have crumpled it. A hurried worker might have tossed it aside, but he treated it as a ledger deserves treatment. Cords must keep their dignity even when their news is stale. His eyes traveled over the crosswalk in front of him, rails shining faintly under light traffic, paint worn but not gone. He measured its length, not with impatience, but with an internal clock set decades earlier, when timing had been survival and not courtesy. He knew when a signal would change before it did. He knew how long steps would take when paired with breath. No hurry, he muttered. Words carried less to the air than to himself. The morning, however, had its own timetable. Inside the post office, clerks sorted envelopes with practiced motions, hands passing letters, as though they carried weight beyond postage. A flag above the entrance shifted slightly, its rope tapping the pole in small metallic notes that punctuated silence. Pigeons perched on the roof, their feathers lifting in agreement with the day's modest breeze. The patrol car at the curb adjusted its stance as the officer inside shifted gears, tires nudging forward half a length before resting again. The red and blue lights remained quiet, their potential stored for later. From the bench, the old man glanced once at the vehicle, not with suspicion but with the calm acknowledgement of someone who had seen uniforms long before. This one. He placed the folded paper beside him on the bench, a placeholder, as though saving the seat for someone who might not come. His hand returned to the cane, fingers resting where grip met wood. The dog tag pressed against his chest in its usual rhythm, neither heavy nor forgotten, only present. The town continued, its measured awakening, shutters lifted, doors unlocked, buses sighed, and the morning's uniforms, prepared to meet one another before the hour, grew busy enough to forget such meetings mattered. The young officer's day began the way most of her days did, with the measured ceremony of uniform. The shirt, buttoned from collar to hem, seemed squared against her shoulders. The radio slid into place on her belt, a familiar weight that clicked once before settling. She tied her hair back with the precision of someone who knew stray strands would irritate more than distract. Her badge caught the morning light without announcement, reflecting only enough to confirm its metal still held polished dot. At roll call she had nodded along with the instructions routes, marked on a whiteboard. Notes about construction near 4th. Reminders to watch for expired meters by the post office. Her name was called, she answered, and the list continued. Nothing in the tone suggested today would be different from yesterday, or tomorrow. Now, as she walked her assigned stretch of sidewalk, her boots found rhythm against concrete. Not heavy, not light, simply the pace of someone new enough to want it right, but practiced enough to know the job was repetition. She stopped once to straighten the strap of her vest, then adjusted the brim of her cap against the sun's modest rise. In her hand rested the citation book. Its pages, crisp and unused in the back half, waited like fresh notebooks at school, daring her to mark them. She had flipped the cover open at the start of shift, pen ready, the first page eager to be claimed. Already she had written one plate number in the top corner, the ink dark and deliberate. Beneath it, her script angled neatly, an instruction printed in the careful handwriting she had never lost from school days. The body cam sat high on her chest, its small lens blinking the slow rhythm of standby. Each blink confirmed it was recording, impartial and thorough. The machine's memory sharper than hers would ever be. She had learned to stop noticing it, except when a hand drifted near her collar, brushing the light by accident. Still, its presence shaped posture, reminding her that every shrug, every pause, every laugh belonged not just to her, but to the record. The street she patrolled was modest in scale, but complex in habit. Delivery trucks stopped against hydrants for just a minute. Commuters pulled into spaces with meters flashing expired, muttering apologies before hurrying away. Students cut corners, jaywalking in loose groups, certain that the world would bend around them. Her job was not to scold, but to note, to write what the day presented. Tickets were not punishment in her training, they were correction. Reminders written in ink that money reinforced. A bakery near the corner vented the smell of bread into the air, warm and distracting. She checked her watch, the minute hand edging toward an hour that made pastries tempting. But she kept walking. The post office sat half a block ahead, its steps wide, its flag steady. She could see the bench already, a small shape against the wall, someone seated, newspaper folded with care. Her thumb tapped the spine of the ticket book. She thought of it the way others think of ledgers, not cruel, not indulgent, only necessary. Each page a mark of presence, each line proof she had been where she was assigned. She had been told during training that the first ticket of the day mattered. It set the tone, a beginning that shaped the rest of the shift. Her pen hovered above the paper, waiting for the day to name itself. At the curb, a sedan edged too far past faded paint, its front tire kissing the yellow line. She noted it, circled once, and stopped. The driver was not present. She began to write make, model, plate number, the words filling the clean rectangle. Her script remained neat, careful, as though each letter could prove diligence. She glanced at the body cam, the blink still steady, indifferent. The book's first page was no longer empty. It carried ink now, instructions translated into fines, a mark against someone's mourning. She tore the slip with care, pressed it under the wiper blade, and stepped back dot above her. The sky prepared whether she couldn't read yet, clouds, deciding whether to gather or wander. The street remained modest, alive with noises that belonged more to routine than to drama. A dog's bark, the squeak of brakes, the clink of a register drawer inside the diner. She closed the ticket book and tapped its corner against her palm. The day would give her more names, more plates, more rectangles to fill. For now, she walked toward the post office steps, unaware that the bench ahead held someone whose presence would mark the book more deeply than ink ever could. The signal at Main and Elm changed with its usual indifference. The box of lights above the intersection shifting from orange to red, then to the pale walking figure meant to reassure pedestrians. Cars braked with soft squeals. A bus shuddered as it came to rest, and the town's morning rearranged itself around the pause. Across the street, the 93-year-old veteran rose from the bench with the kind of patience that had been drilled into him long before. Traffic signals existed. He leaned on the cane first, testing the ground as if to confirm the sidewalk had kept its promise overnight. His hand, ridged with veins, closed over the handle worn smooth from years of service. It was not vanity that kept him moving, but habit, the same discipline that had once sent him across very different lines, painted on very different ground. The dog tag against his chest pressed lightly as he stood, the cool metal noting the change in posture. The rails of the crosswalk stretched ahead, white stripes dulled to gray but still legible. Faded paint, cracked at the edges, reminded him of the supply lines he once marked in chalk across maps spread on crate lids. He regarded them now as coordinates not perfect, but good enough to follow. The distance across was not far, perhaps 20 paces, yet he calculated them as carefully as a man calculates rations. 20 paces, each one slower than before, but steady if taken with breath in rhythm. No hurry, he told himself, the words part reassurance, part command. Cars idled with engines muttering their discontent, but he stepped forward without apology. His shoes, polished enough to carry memory but not shine, tapped lightly against asphalt. Each step found its partner in the cane, a practiced duet. The signal counted down in red numbers above him. Though he did not lift his eyes to check, he trusted his pace more than the clock. Halfway across, breeze moved through the intersection, carrying with it the smell of coffee from the diner and faint exhaust from the waiting bus. For a moment, the sounds braided together, the hiss of brakes, the hum of the patrol car idling nearby, the shuffle of feet on the opposite curb. He walked through it as if through weather, unaffected by the mix of noise and air. The officer, standing a few yards away, with ticket book still warm from its first use, noticed him then. She saw the wool cap, the newspaper folded under his arm, the careful calibration of steps. At first she did not recognize the weight in his movements. She only saw a slow walker, the kind who might delay traffic. Her thumb tapped the closed ticket book, waiting for the light to change back in her favor. The veteran reached the far curb, just as the red numbers finished their descent. He did not break stride, did not rush the last 2 steps, only placed his cane squarely on the concrete and shifted his weight with calm precision. The cars rumbled impatiently, but he had already cleared the way. The light changed, and engines resumed their song. He turned toward the post office door, hand brushing the rail as if to steady both himself and the building. Inside, clerks moved stacks of envelopes with the efficiency of people who had done so for decades. He did not enter yet. Instead, he paused at the edge of the sidewalk and let the morning air pass through his lungs. His eyes lingered on the rails he had just crossed, the stripes fading behind him like lines erased but not forgotten. Memory worked differently at 90. Distances shortened, but recollections lengthened. Each step on the crosswalk had been an echo of other crossings. Beaches under fire, bridges that trembled under weight, airfields marked by flares instead of paint. The stripes on Elm were humbler, but they carried the same command: move forward. Keep rhythm. Trust that the ground will hold. The officer shifted her stance, curiosity pressing against her routine. The veteran lowered himself back onto the bench. Newspaper folded once more. Cane leaned where it had been before. The crosswalk had done its job, and so had he. The town continued, indifferent yet accommodating, unaware that 20 measured paces had carried decades across its rails. The officer approached the bench with the same deliberate pace she had carried all morning. The ticket book balanced in her hand like a ledger, waiting for its next entry. The post office steps were busy with small errands people balancing packages, a clerk propping the door open with his shoulder, a boy stamping his foot against a loose shoelace. Amid the quiet shuffle, the officer's boots met the pavement with a firmness that made heads lift briefly, then return to their business. The veteran had settled again, the newspaper folded neatly, the cane leaning, the dog tag resting still against his chest. His eyes followed the movement of the street, rather than the words on the page. He noticed her before she noticed him fully, but he did not shift his posture. He remained the kind of steady that had less to do with strength and more to do with years. The officer paused by the curb where a sedan sat crooked, its front tire tipped over the line of faded paint. She flipped open her ticket book, pen ready, and bent slightly to read the plate. Ink found paper once more, the sound of pen scratching filling a moment otherwise reserved for engines idling. The veteran watched without comment. When she straightened, her eyes caught his briefly. She saw the wool cap, the newspaper, the cane. She saw, too, the small tremor in his hand as he reached to adjust the folded paper. Without intending harm, her mouth curved in a short laugh. Not cruel, only careless. The sound of someone young observing someone old, mistaking slow movement for weakness. The laugh traveled no farther than the space between them, but it was enough. He did not look up at once. He adjusted the newspaper again, crease aligning with crease, then placed it carefully beside him on the bench. His hand settled on the cane's handle, thumb stroking the polished wood once, a gesture as natural as breathing. The laugh had already passed, but the air carried its echo, faint and undeniable. The officer cleared her throat, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of recognition that the sound had been misplaced. She shifted her weight, one boot scuffing slightly against the curb. The body cam blinked its indifferent red eye, storing every small movement without judgment. She tapped her pen against the closed ticket book. a nervous rhythm that gave away more than she meant it to. The veteran finally lifted his gaze, slow but certain. His eyes were steady, not sharp, not wounded, simply present. He had heard laughter in worse places. He had carried it through barracks, through cold mornings when youth covered its fear with jokes. But here, in the modest light of a town street, the sound pressed against him differently. Not heavy, not unbearable, just careless enough to deserve an answer. A bus exhaled at the corner. The flag above the post office gave a small tug in the morning's mild wind. Around them, the town went on, unbothered, the small commerce of letters and errands continuing without pause. Yet in the small square of space between the bench and the curb, silence gathered, asking to be kept or broken. The officer shifted again, glancing toward the car she had just ticketed, as if work could shield her from what lingered. But the veteran's eyes remained on her, unblinking, waiting for nothing more than the right measure of respect. His hand pressed more firmly on the cane, not in anger, not in impatience only, in readiness. The laugh, brief as it had been, had marked the morning. It had not traveled far, but far enough. The town held its usual noises, yet both of them knew the moment had become something that they would not forget. The officer let her pen rest, the book close. Her throat tightened with words unspoken. The veteran, steady, prepared to answer, not with a shout, not with rebuke, but with something smaller, weightier, 5 words that had lived longer than uniforms or ticket books. The silence between them held, stretched taut not by volume but by restraint. The officer stood with her boots planted square on the curb, her ticket book closed now, pen tucked against its spine. The veteran sat, as he had before, newspaper folded to the same faithful crease. Kane leaned where his hand could find it, without looking. Around them, the town kept moving, engines idling, a doorbell chiming at the bakery, footsteps striking their steady bargains with the sidewalk. None of those sounds seemed to belong in the small square of air they shared. She adjusted her cap, a nervous gesture dressed as professionalism. The body cam blinked, impartial and thorough, recording the moments her training had not prepared her for. She had been taught procedure, escalation, respect, but not how to retrieve a laugh that had already escaped, careless as a leaf caught on wind. Her throat felt the weight of words she might say, but none found shape. The veteran's gaze did not waver. His eyes, pale with age but sharp with history, searched her face as though reading a map. He had read many before, paper maps crinkled in trenches, drawn lines across sand, coordinates muttered under fire. He looked at her now as if she were another set of coordinates, someone who needed direction more than correction. His hand rested lightly on the dog tag under his shirt, the chain pressing against skin that had carried its chill through decades. When he spoke, his voice did not rise above the hum of the street. It carried the weight of authority without force, like a man used to being obeyed but not demanding it. He said 5 words, simple and exact, the kind that fit inside a small breath, yet stretched across years. They landed not as rebuke, not as threat, but as fact. Her shoulders shifted, the words pressed through her uniform, through badge and fabric, settling where training manuals had left empty spaces. She blinked once, then again, as though her eyes needed help catching up with her ears. The laugh she had given moments ago shrank inside her chest. Replayed and reduced to the sound, it truly was thin, unnecessary. A car passed, radio spilling fragments of a song into the air. She didn't hear it. The words held her steady, not by volume, but by the authority of having been earned. She looked down at her ticket book, its rectangle blank for the moment, and felt the ink inside her pen as something heavy, rather than routine. The book could wait. The morning had been given another kind of record. The veteran leaned back against the bench, his hand sliding from the cane to the newspaper. He smoothed the crease with deliberate care, as though the paper itself required reassurance. He did not speak again. 5 words had been enough. He had lived long enough to know that some sentences require no companion. The officer glanced at her body cam. Its red eye still blinking. The machine had captured her laugh. His reply, the silence that followed, it would file them alongside the mundane records of her shift license plates. Conversations at doorways, instructions passed over the radio. Yet she knew no report would carry the moment in full. A camera could store images and sound. It could not record how 5 words could remeasure the weight of a uniform. She cleared her throat again. Not for defense this time, but to steady herself. The patrol car idled where she had left it, engine humming patiently, lights quiet. For the first time that morning, she considered what the uniform meant when met with someone who had worn another kind, in another time. Underweight she could only imagine. The town remained unchanged. The bakery line shuffled forward. The bus exhaled and took on new passengers. Pigeons shifted along the post office roof. But the space between bench and curb had altered. It had measured the distance between laughter and respect, and it had chosen to hold the latter. The veteran folded the newspaper one last time and set it beside him, hands resting on the cane's handle. His work for the moment was done. The officer stood, hands now still, words unspoken, but ready to follow the 5 he had given. The day moved on, but not without marking them both. The officer lingered by the curb, pen still resting against the spine of her citation book. The words he had spoken seemed to hover in the morning air, not fading so much as settling into everything within reach. She felt their imprint even as the traffic resumed its normal rhythm, even as voices drifted from the post office steps. She tried to stand as though nothing had shifted, but her hands betrayed her, adjusting the ticket book more than it needed. The veteran did not move quickly. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers slow but exact, and withdrew a wallet softened by years. Its leather corners were frayed, the fold worn thin, until it behaved more like cloth than hide. He opened it with care, not as a display, but as one completes a ritual, deliberate, steady, precise. Inside were layers of paper and plastic objects, ordinary to most, yet carrying a weight particular to him. First came the VA card, its laminate clouded at the edges, a corner chipped, but still intact. He placed it on his knee, tapping it once with a finger, so the light caught the faded photograph. The officer saw his name printed there, block letters familiar and unbending. She knew better than to ask for it. Still, she read it in silence, memorizing letters she would not forget soon. Next came an envelope, creased from repeated folding, its edges soft from years of being carried. The veteran smoothed it once against his thigh, then left it closed, as though its contents did not need revealing. It sat atop the VA card, paper stacked on plastic, record stacked on recognition. From another pocket, he drew a small coin. It clinked against the metal of the bench when he set it down. Not currency, not casual, it was a unit coin, worn smooth at the edges, the engraving faint but traceable. He tapped it once, the sound sharper than its size should allow, a reminder that small objects sometimes carried the weight of nations. The officer shifted, her gaze between the 3 items: card, envelope, coin. Each seemed to answer the laugh she had let slip earlier, not with anger but with evidence. Paper for record, plastic for authority, tin for memory. Together they spoke more than words could. She swallowed, the body cam blinking as though it, too, recognized the gravity of objects set in plain sight. Her fingers twitched, wanting to busy themselves with the ticket book again, but she resisted. She let the silence hold. The veteran gathered the items slowly, not rushing their return. He slid the envelope back into his wallet, tucked the card behind a faded photograph, pocketed the coin with a faint metallic whisper. Each motion seemed less about hiding them than about keeping them safe for the next moment that might require their presence. When the last object was returned, he settled back, newspaper once more in his lap, cane angled steady against his knee. Nothing about him seemed boastful. He had not performed, only placed reminders in the world's sightline. The officer exhaled without meaning to, the sound barely more than a sigh. She realized how little her ticket book meant in comparison. Its carbon copies and perforated edges, with thin paper records of parking and paint. Nothing beside dog tags, coins, and letters carried through decades. The town continued. Its modest day mail carts squeaked across tile floors inside the post office. A bicycle bell rang faintly down the block. The bus sighed and pulled away. Yet on the bench, the air seemed weighted, organized by the quiet order of paper, plastic, and tin. The officer adjusted her stance. Shoulders straighter now, pen pressed more gently against the spine of her book. She nodded once, not as acknowledgement of duty but as recognition of presence. The veteran returned the gesture with silence, his hand resting where the cane met, wood polished by time. The moment passed without proclamation, but its shape remained. Objects had spoken where words might have failed, filling the space between laugh and respect. The bench kept its witness, the body cam blinked its steady record, and the morning's lesson anchored itself in small, tangible things. The officer felt the body cam more than she ever had before. Its small, square lens sat on her chest, blinking its slow red pulse, impartial and tireless. It recorded everything: her careless laugh, his silence, the 5 words he had spoken, and the quiet ritual of paper, plastic, and tin laid on the bench. She wondered, briefly, how the moment would look later. Flattened into footage, just another clip among thousands of hours stored somewhere anonymous. The machine could capture sight and sound, but not the weight that pressed into the air now. She adjusted her posture, tugged once at her vest, and shifted the citation book from one hand to the other. The pen tapped against the cardboard cover, restless but without purpose. She imagined how the audio would sound, latter pen tapping like a metronome. Her voice absent, his steady reply carried without ornament. The record would keep it, but the record could not feel it. The sky above them had been uncertain all morning. Clouds moved in low sheets, gray at the edges, as though the day had not decided whether to drizzle or hold. The veteran tilted his head once toward the sky, reading it the way he had once read weather off coastlines and ridges. He squinted against the light, then returned his eyes to the folded newspaper on his lap. He did not need to announce his forecasts. Age had taught him that weather behaved on its own schedule. Indifferent to commentary, thought the officer pulled her cap lower, shading her eyes. A wind moved through the street, light enough to stir papers on the steps of the post office, strong enough to lift the edges of her citation book. She pressed it flat with her palm, as though that gesture could anchor more than paper. The body cam blinked, recording the change in light as clouds gathered. She thought of it less as a camera and more as a silent witness, unblinking where she had flinched. She wondered if others would review the footage, supervisors in neat shirts, screens lit in quiet rooms. Would they hear the laugh? Would they pause at the moment the veteran's hand rested on the coin? Would they understand that silence had spoken more clearly than sound? Across the street, a barber swept his stoop, pausing once to watch the sky, then resuming with the patience of someone who knew rain or shine. Hair kept growing. A woman with a stroller adjusted its plastic cover, already prepared for drizzle. A bus driver leaned against his door, arms folded, his eyes following clouds with the same resignation. The town as a whole behaved like people waiting for weather's decision. The officer shifted her stance again. Her hand brushed the bracelet she wore, silver links with stamped letters. She twisted it once, feeling the engraving bite against her skin. The date it carried was not public knowledge, but it traveled with her. The veteran's gaze flicked briefly toward it, then back to his paper, as though he knew enough not to ask. The first drop of rain struck the pavement between them, darkening the gray. Another followed, then another, until the air gave up its hesitation. Not a downpour, only a fine mist, the kind that blurred outlines and made edges less certain. She felt it collect on the brim of her cap, roll down the sleeves of her shirt, speckled the ticket book in her hand. The veteran did not move for cover. His wool cap darkened where drops found it, but he remained seated, steady, cane upright beside him. He had been through worse weather, storms that did not ask permission. A little rain would not send him inside. The officer considered the patrol car idling nearby, its windshield wipers idle, waiting for her hand. She did not move toward it. She stayed where she was, pen still balanced on the ticket book, body cam blinking, rain marking her uniform. The weather had made its decision. So had she. Together they occupied the small square of space between bench and curb. Two figures in modest rain, one with a dog tag pressing cool against his chest, the other with a bracelet catching drops. The body cam recorded the water's patter, the silence between them, and the unspoken truth that sometimes weather carries more than clouds. The rain did not last long. It pressed itself into the air with a few minutes of persistence, enough to darken caps and sleeves, enough to send letters in the post office clinging together in their trays. Then, as quickly as it began, it withdrew, leaving the pavement marked with irregular patches, dark coins, scattered across the lighter gray. The veteran brushed one hand along his trouser leg, sweeping away what drops had gathered there. The officer shook her shoulders once, the motion as brisk as a bird after flight, and returned her hand to the ticket book. The bench had carried the weight of strangers for years. Workers waiting on buses, children eating ice cream too quickly, shoppers resting between errands. Today it seemed to absorb more than but. The veteran's presence made it a ledger in itself, a record of names not carved into its wood, but impressed by his sitting there. He leaned against the backrest as though it had been built for him alone, though the bench had known many. His hand traced one shallow groove, worn by years of use, and his thumb lingered there. The officer, watching without meaning to, saw how he touched the groove, not absent-minded, not nervous, deliberate, like someone reading Braille. It was as if the bench carried memory for him, not of his own life, but of the town's. His silence was a kind of introduction, and the wood beneath him seemed to echo it. Across the street, the barber paused his sweeping to look again. He had seen the man many times, always at the same bench, always at the same hour. He leaned on the broom, eyes narrowed, and called across traffic, with a small nod. "Morning, Walter." The veteran lifted his chin in acknowledgement. The name traveled farther than the laugh had. Not sharp, but steady. "Walter." The bench seemed to straighten under it, as if names, once spoken, could wait a place with permanence. The officer noted the exchange without comment. She had not asked his name, not thought to, distracted by procedure and paperwork. Hearing it now shifted something. Walter, a simple word, but it rearranged the air between them. He was no longer just an old man on a bench, no longer just another passerby observed during a routine patrol. He had a name, and the town clearly knew it. From the diner window, the cook raised a hand, spatula still in grip, and mouthed, "Morning, Walt." The word, shortened by familiarity, carried the same weight. A delivery driver pulling boxes from his truck gave a quick salute, not military but friendly, and said, "Good to see you, sir." The honorific slipped in naturally, as though automatic. The officer felt herself shift, not physically but inwardly. She realized she was the only one in the immediate scene who had not known his name, who had addressed him only with laughter and silence. Now the bench, the barber, the cook, and even the driver had restored him with a name she had failed to ask. Walter adjusted the newspaper on his lap, its crease still holding, though his fingers pressed it once more as if tightening the line. He seemed unbothered by the recognition, untempted to answer each greeting with more than a nod or a glance. Names to him were not ceremony. They were tools, like canes and coins, meant to be used and then put away. The officer shifted the ticket book to her other hand. She wondered if her body cam would note the spoken name clearly, whether later playback would catch Walter and preserve it alongside the image of the bench. She imagined supervisors watching and marking the moment, though she doubted they would understand its weight. A name, after all, was not evidence, it was presence. The rain had left behind a faint shine on the pavement, and the air smelled briefly of damp brick. Walter leaned back, cane steady against his leg, eyes returning to the crosswalk he had measured earlier. The officer stood nearby, notebook closed now, posture less rigid than before. The bench had learned a name, and with it the street gained another layer of history. Quiet, unspectacular, but unshakable. The morning moved forward, but it carried Walter's name with it. The way benches keep the warmth of a body long after it has risen. Walter's wallet did not close quickly. It sat open across his palm, as though it had something more to give. The officer noticed the faint tremor in his hand. Not weakness, but the steadiness of age, where muscles worked with deliberate care. He lifted one flap, thumb brushing past the VA card, tucked neatly into its slot, past the folded envelope that had been returned to place. Beneath them, behind the clouded plastic window, lay a small photograph. The photograph had lived in that pocket for decades. Its corners had softened until they curled upward like petals. Its surface rubbed thin where fingers had pressed again and again. The image itself, faded to sepia, showed three boys in uniform. They stood shoulder to shoulder, caps tilted, expressions caught between pride and apprehension. Their boots shone despite the dirt that had clearly been underfoot. One boy, third from the left, had the same sharp line at the mouth as Walter now carried. He didn't pull the photograph out. He didn't need to. He simply angled the wallet so the officer could see, keeping his hand firmly around it, as though the act of showing was permission, not surrender. The plastic covering had cracked near the corner, a spiderweb of lines that caught the morning light. Through it, the faces looked out, blurred by time but unbroken. The officer leaned slightly, careful not to reach. The body cam blinked, catching the angle, but she knew the machine could not translate the way the moment pressed against her. She studied the photograph, recognizing uniforms she had only seen in textbooks or memorial displays. She looked at the boy with the familiar jawline, the one who seemed to share his gaze. She realized she wasn't looking at a stranger's past. She was looking at the man before her, pared down to youth. Walter said nothing. He didn't narrate names, didn't explain who had survived or who hadn't. The photograph did that work in silence. His thumb tapped the edge of the wallet once, as if underlining its presence. Then he let the silence do what words could not carry, the weight without decoration. Across the street, the barber had resumed sweeping, though his eyes drifted toward the bench again. From the diner window, steam clouded the glass, but the cook leaned slightly forward, spatula idle in his hand. The town seemed to pause, without knowing why. The officer felt it too, as though everyone sensed the photograph existed, even if only she could see it clearly. She thought briefly of the photograph she carried in her own wallet to Nice, grinning on a schoolyard swing, hair tangled by wind. Her photo was glossy, recent, edges crisp. Walter's photo had lived lives beyond a frame, had been carried through decades, folded into pockets that had known rain, sweat, and long marches. She felt the difference, sharp and humbling. Walter closed the wallet with care, the leather folding over the photograph like a hand placed gently on memory. He slipped it back into his coat pocket, patting once to be sure it was secure. The act was less about storage than about returning something to its rightful place. His hand lingered a moment before leaving the pocket, as if confirming the photograph would not wander without him. The officer shifted her stance, eyes lowering to the citation book in her hand. The ticket she had written earlier now felt light, paper too thin to matter against decades pressed into one fading. She closed the book more firmly, pen tucked against its spine, and let her arm fall still. The morning around them resumed. A bus pulled away from the curb with a hiss, its windows fogged by breath inside. The barber's broom scratched lightly against concrete. The flag at the post office stirred in a new breeze. Yet the air carried something different now, a name and a photograph layered over the town's ordinary rhythm. The officer looked once more at Walter, seated steady on the bench, Kane at his side, the faint outline of the wallet pressing against his coat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The photograph had already said enough, through cracked plastic, through faces that still held the sharpness of memory. The town moved forward, but the moment remained, anchored by the quiet persistence of an image that refused to fade. The officer's radio crackled at her side, a sudden intrusion into the quiet that had settled between bench and curb. She lifted it instinctively, pressing the button clipped near her shoulder. Dispatch asked for confirmation on a license plate she had already written down, routine words spoken in a neutral cadence. She gave the reply, voice level, then released the button. Static hummed for a beat, before fading back into silence. But then another voice followed, slipping in through the same channel. It was slower, older, carrying a timbre that did not belong to dispatch. The tone was calm, almost casual, yet it held authority. The kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The voice asked again, not for the plate, not for procedure, but for Walter by name. "Is Walter there?" The officer froze, eyes lifting from her ticket book. She glanced at the veteran on the bench. He did not move quickly. He simply tilted his head, listening. The name on the radio had landed without hesitation, the syllables spoken as though they belonged to someone long known. She pressed the radio again, her thumb firmer this time. "Say again," she asked, though she had heard clearly. The voice repeated itself. Walter N. "Tell him Carter says good morning." The officer lowered her hand, the radio still buzzing faintly. She looked at Walter. His expression did not change much, just the faintest lift at the corner of his mouth, a recognition that had nothing to do with her. He tapped the cane once against the pavement, a small sound that seemed to serve as acknowledgement. The laugh she had given earlier shrank further inside her chest. The air between them tightened with something different. Not tension, not confrontation, but weight. The second voice had given Walter more than recognition. It had drawn a line of connection between him and others. A line she suddenly found herself standing across. The radio hissed again before quieting. She imagined the operator at dispatch leaning back, smiling, perhaps knowing that Walter had been seen once more. She wondered how many others knew him this way, by name, by history, by the sound of his presence carried through unseen channels. Walter remained on the bench, steady, one hand still resting on the folded newspaper. He did not rush to explain who Carter was. He did not glance at her for validation. He let the silence hold, confident that the name alone had been enough. The officer shifted her stance, boots scuffing lightly against the curb. Unsure what reply to give, a delivery truck rumbled past, its engine rattling, but the moment did not disperse. The barber had stopped sweeping again, broom angled against his shoulder. Across the street, the cook in the diner leaned on the counter, half a smile on his face, as though he, too, had caught the name through the static. The town seemed to know more than she did. The officer felt her cheeks warm, though the air had cooled after the rain. Her ticket book weighed in her hand, suddenly trivial, its blank pages less important than the simple fact that Walter's name had been spoken aloud across official channels. She thought of her body cam again, how it would record not just her posture, not just the objects he had shown, but the voice carried through the radio. A machine would hold the moment. But she knew she was the one who would have to live with it. Walter leaned back slightly, Kane balanced at his side. His eyes moved toward the flag at the post office, then back across the crosswalk he had measured earlier. His mouth stayed quiet, but the radio's second voice had spoken enough. He did not need to add anything. The officer let out a breath, slow and controlled. She looked down at her uniform, the brass of her badge dulled by a drop of water still clinging there. She straightened her shoulders, less from training than from something else, something quieter. Walter had been given another layer of recognition, first through greetings, now through a name spoken on the air. Her role, she realized, was no longer about writing or correcting. It was about listening. The radio clicked once more, then fell silent. The officer left it hanging, her hand dropping to her side. Walter tapped his cane again, the sound light but certain. The town resumed its rhythm, but the bench had been claimed once more by a voice carried through static, by a name spoken with respect, by a connection she could not ignore. The rain had dried in patches, leaving the pavement patterned like old paper stained by ink drops. Across from the post office, the diner began to fill, its doorbell chiming at intervals as customers entered, shook off damp jackets, and found booths. Inside, the owner stood behind the counter with his ledger open, a thick book bound in cracked brown leather. He did not use digital systems as others did. He preferred ink, columns, and the slow arithmetic of pen strokes. The ledger bore not only totals of sales, but names, dates, and notes that only he understood. He wrote carefully, the date at the top of the page, then a line beneath it that marked the first entry of the day. Coffee paid forward. The words stood alone, not attached to a customer's name. He wrote them because he knew Walter was outside, as he had been most mornings, and that someone inside would cover his drink, whether he asked or not. This was the way the town balanced itself. A waitress placed a cardboard cup on the counter, steam curling from its open lid. The owner nodded, slid the ledger slightly aside, and scrawled an underline beneath his entry. He closed the book halfway, not snapping it shut, but folding it against itself the way one might keep a secret available. The cup was carried out to the bench, where Walter received it without ceremony. He lifted the lid, inhaled once, then set it on the space beside his folded newspaper. The officer watched, ticket book still idle in her hand. She noticed how the transaction carried no exchange of coins, no fumbling for wallets. It had been done quietly, like a ritual the town performed without fanfare. She thought of her own work of tickets written, fines collected, tallies kept in systems that measured only in amounts. Here, the ledger across the street measured differently. It marked generosity as much as sales. It recorded gestures that could not be balanced with money. Walter tapped the cane once, then lifted the cup with both hands. He sipped slowly, steam clouding the dog tag that pressed against his shirt. He did not look at the officer, nor at the diner, but the act itself seemed directed at everyone who watched. He had accepted the offering without question, and the ledger now carried proof of it. Ink pressed into paper for permanence. The officer thought of her training, how reports demanded totals, hours, statistics, compliance. She wondered how many things were lost between numbers, how many names were erased when tallies replaced them. She thought again of the photograph Walter had shown her. Faces captured, but never counted. Lives recorded not in totals, but in memory. A customer inside the diner leaned over the ledger when the owner stepped away, squinting at the words written there. He smiled faintly, understanding without explanation. The book was not for display, but those who glimpsed it carried its meaning. It was less an account and more a record of how the town remembered itself. Walter set the cup back on the bench, his fingers resting against its warm cardboard surface. The officer shifted her stance again, the weight of the ticket book now almost awkward in her grasp. She glanced at the body cam, wondering if it would catch the ledger across the street, or if the angle was too narrow. Would the camera understand a line of ink reading paid forward? Machines, she realized, did not keep ledgers in the same way towns did. The barber across the way resumed, sweeping, pausing once to wave toward the bench. Walter lifted his cup in reply, a silent acknowledgement that needed no words. The officer followed the gesture, her eyes catching the faint smile that touched Walter's mouth before disappearing again. The morning carried on. Buses stopped and started. Pigeons shuffled on the post office roof. The diner's bell chimed with each new customer. Yet, between these ordinary rhythms, the ledger kept its quiet balance, marking not what was owed, but what was offered. The officer exhaled, her hand loosening around the ticket book. She realized the town measured respect differently than she did. It was not found in fines or warnings, but in lines written into old books, in gestures folded into the day, in cups of coffee carried to a bench without announcement. Totals mattered less than the names and the stories they carried. Walter lifted the cup again, steady hands bracing it against the chill in the air. The officer stood close by, watching, learning. The ledger across the street had written him into the day, not as a statistic, but as part of the town's unspoken account. The morning thinned into midday, shadows shortening across the sidewalk. A pair of students hurried past the post office, backpacks slapping against their shoulders, laughter bouncing louder than the traffic. The patrol car remained at the curb, idling in a rhythm that did not quite fit the town's slower pulse. The officer leaned against the fender, ticket book still loose in her hand, body cam steady on her chest. She had been standing longer than the duty required, but something about the old man on the bench seemed to hold her there. The officer glanced at her watch, muttered about wasted time, and closed the ticket book with a sharp slap. The sound startled a pigeon from the gutter. It fluttered up, circled once, then landed back near the bench, as if it had not left at all. Walter looked up at the sound, his eyes narrowing. But he said nothing. "Shouldn't block the bench like it's yours," the officer said. Half to fill the space, half because silence made her uneasy. Her voice carried a tone sharper than she intended. "Other people might want to sit." Walter tilted his head slightly, as if measuring her words the way one measures weather testing, whether it might pass or settle in. His hand rested on the cane, fingers curled but not tense. The officer shifted her weight, impatient. She had learned to cover unease with humor, the kind of humor that comes too quickly. "You planning to guard that bench all day?" she added, lips pulling into a smirk. "Post office doesn't hire lookouts anymore." A small laugh left her throat, quick and shallow. It was the kind of laugh used to disguise nerves, a laugh too thin to hold real amusement. It fell into the air like glass breaking softly. Out of place in the measured calm of the street, a woman passing with a grocery bag slowed, looked briefly at the pair, then decided the scene did not require her voice. She crossed to the other side. Inside the diner, the owner closed his ledger halfway and watched from behind the counter. The barber paused, his sweeping bristles resting against the pavement. The laugh had traveled farther than its weight deserved. Walter did not laugh back. He did not scowl either. He studied the officer's face, not cruelly, but with the patience of someone who had learned to wait until noise exhausted itself. His silence grew heavier than her smirk, pressing against it until the humor wilted. The officer cleared her throat. "Tried again. I'm just saying," she muttered, softer now. But the words hung limp. The laugh that had carried them already revealed itself as misplaced. Walter tapped his cane once, a hollow sound against the sidewalk. The pigeons shuffled, unsettled. He lifted the cup, sipped, and set it down again, this time with more care. Then he leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady, the kind that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "You think it's funny," he said, each word clear, unhurried. "But I've been laughed at before." The officer blinked, her smirk dissolving faster than she could recover it. She did not answer. She did not know yet what he meant, only that his voice carried a weight the laugh could not touch. The barber resumed sweeping, the sound of bristles marking the pause. Inside the diner, someone set a cup on a saucer too firmly, porcelain clinking like punctuation. The town seemed to listen with one ear, tilted toward the bench. Walter lifted the paper from his lap, folded along its crease again, then set it back down. His hands moved with the steadiness of a man who understood that moments could be measured and kept. His eyes did not leave the officer's face. The laugh had ended, but its echo remained, a line drawn too sharply in a quiet day. It waited to be answered not with more noise, but with words that would weigh heavier, words that would not be shaken off as easily. Walter tapped the cane once more, and the silence returned to its place around him, patient, expectant. The silence that followed his remark did not fade quickly. It stretched across the sidewalk, long enough for a bus to sigh at the corner, for a pair of children to race past, dragging their laughter like kites behind them, for the pigeon near the curb to peck twice at nothing. The officer shifted her weight, ticket book still in her hand, though its purpose had long escaped. The smirk she had worn had evaporated. Her face carried something closer to confusion, the kind that comes when a script no longer fits the scene. Walter sat steady on the bench, the folded paper unmoved, the dog tag at his chest, brushing lightly against his shirt with each breath. His cane leaned into his knee, a quiet metronome for the space between them. He let the pause stand, as if silence itself had earned its right to speak first. Then he leaned forward, his hands closing gently around the handle of the cane. His voice low but sure. "I buried more friends laughing." 5 words, no more. They arrived with no flourish, no anger. They were laid down as plainly as a ledger entry, final and undeniable. They did not accuse, they testified. The officer blinked once, twice, the phrase rooting in her chest before her mind caught up. Her body straightened, shoulders drawing back as if pulled by a string. Her hand, still clutching the ticket book, lowered without intention until it touched her thigh. The laugh that had escaped her earlier now seemed a trespass, something she wished she could gather from the air and fold back into her throat. Dot around them, the town carried on, but slower. The barber across the street paused mid-sweep, bristles pressed flat to the ground. Inside the diner, a fork rested against a plate longer than it needed to. Even the pigeons shuffled less. The words had found their own echo. Uninvited yet welcomed by everything within earshot. Walter's eyes did not shine with anger, nor with tears. They held the steady gaze of someone who had rehearsed these words silently for years, speaking them only when required. They carried a history that no photograph could capture fully. No report could reduce to data. Each friend buried was a story folded into those 5 words. A chapter left unturned by those who had not lived it. The officer swallowed, the sound loud to her own ears. She looked at the dog tag glinting in the sun, then at the newspaper folded along its careful crease. Her body leaned back an inch, not out of fear, but from the force of respect that had arrived unannounced. She realized she had stepped into a space that did not belong to her laughter. She had mocked without knowing she was standing at the edge of a graveyard. Carried in memory, Walter lifted his coffee cup again, steady in both hands. He sipped, set it back down, and resumed his posture, as if nothing unusual had been said. For him, perhaps, nothing had. The words were not a revelation, but a truth he lived with daily. Like the ache in his knees, like the dog tag cooling his chest. The officer drew in a breath, let it out slow. The body cam at her chest blinked its red light, recording everything without understanding. She thought of the footage later, imagined supervisors skimming it, catching the words without hearing them. Machines would store the sound, but they would not carry the weight. Only those present would know the ground had shifted. A boy on a bicycle rolled past, calling a greeting to Walter. The old man lifted his hand in reply. Brief, but enough. The boy pedaled on, unaware he had passed through a moment that tilted the day. The officer spoke finally, her voice quieter, stripped of its earlier edge. I didn't mean. Walter stopped her with the smallest shake of his head. Meaning doesn't change what's buried. His tone carried no malice, only fact. He leaned back against the bench, folded his hands on the paper, and looked down the street as though waiting for nothing more than the next bus. The officer stepped back, the rubber sole of her boot scuffing the pavement. 5 words had done what her training never prepared her for. They had made her retreat, not from command, not from law, but from the recognition of a history larger than her authority. The ticket book in her hand now felt unnecessary, flimsy, an object meant for minor infractions and small order. It was not built for this. She closed it and slid it into her pocket, letting her hand fall free. Walter remained steady as the bench beneath him. The town resumed its rhythm slowly, but something had shifted. The barber swept again, slower. Inside the diner, the ledger was opened. A line added without being seen. Coffee-veteran-paid. The officer stood for another moment, then turned her gaze away. 5 words still traveled with her, pressing against her chest like an unseen medal. The street carried on as if nothing had happened. Yet the air between them was no longer the same. Cars passed with ordinary hums. Brakes sighed at the corner, and the barber resumed his sweeping with measured strokes. But the officer no longer stood where she had been. She had stepped back a single pace at first, then another half without realizing it. Distance had appeared, not demanded, but created, as if the weight of his words required more space than the sidewalk allowed. Walter remained where he was, shoulders settled against the bench, his folded paper still resting on his lap. He had not raised his voice, had not moved except for the tapping of his cane and the lift of his cup, yet he had shifted the ground beneath her. His 5 words hung invisible but undeniable, heavier than any badge or book she carried. Her hand, free now of the ticket pad, flexed once against her side. She felt the awkward rhythm of her own breathing, quicker than usual, like a runner who had not trained enough for the pace. The body cam still blinked, its small light steady, indifferent. She wondered if it had captured the exact moment she stepped back. If supervisors might question why distance had replaced control. Walter adjusted his cap slightly, tugging it lower against the sun. He did not look at her, did not mark her retreat with triumph or reproach. He seemed simply to let it stand, as if stepping back were its own kind of respect. The town had taught him long ago that silence could be more eloquent than scolding. Inside the diner, the owner closed the ledger and turned the page, as though recording the day's new entry without ink. The waitress refilled a cup at the counter, glancing once through the window at the bench before returning to her duties. Even the bell above the door seemed quieter, ringing with more restraint. The officer looked down at her boots, polished but scuffed at the toes from weeks of duty. They were meant to hold firm on asphalt, on tiled floors, on gravel shoulders. They were not meant to retreat. Yet here they were, a step farther from him than before. She drew in another breath, let it leave slowly, as though her lungs had learned a lesson about patience. A boy on a skateboard clattered by. wheels striking cracks in the pavement, a sound too sharp for the moment. He passed between them, and the silence stitched itself back together after he was gone. Walter's eyes followed the boy for a second, then returned to the folded paper. He smoothed the crease again, as if the world could be held steady by lines made true. The officer shifted again, but this time not forward. She leaned lightly against the patrol car, arms folding across her chest. It was not a stance of defiance, nor of superiority. Was the posture of someone learning how to hold still. The badge at her chest gleamed in the thin sun, but she felt it dimmed by the dog tag that shone in smaller, quieter flashes from Walter's collar. She thought of her academy days of drills that taught her to issue commands, to assert presence, to read compliance in body language. None of those lessons had prepared her for this. An old man with steady hands, a folded paper, and 5 words that pushed her back without force. Walter lifted his coffee again. The steam had thinned, but he drank with the same patience as before. He set it down gently, his fingers lingering on the cup, as though keeping it steady for the town itself. The officer watched her breath easing into rhythm with his. Somewhere, a church bell struck the quarter hour. Its sound traveled over roofs and wires, over the steady sweep of the barber's broom, over the clink of porcelain in the diner. The officer heard it differently, now not as routine, but as punctuation to the moment that had already marked her. She had stepped back. Yes, but not only from him. She had stepped back from her own certainty, from the thin laugh that had failed to hold ground, from the assumption that age on a bench could be taken lightly. The distance was not defeat. It was recognition. Walter did not move to fill the space she had given. He allowed it to exist, a quiet acknowledgement that not all lessons require a lecture. Some require only 5 words, and the silence that follows. The officer adjusted her stance once more, letting her hands fall open at her sides. She did not speak. For the first time that day, silence suited her. The patrol car's engine ticked quietly as it cooled, a steady metronome against the day. The officer leaned back against the door, arms uncrossed now, fingers brushing the edge of her vest, where the small black lens blinked its unblinking eye. The body cam had been recording from the moment she stepped from the car. Its memory carried the laugh, the silence, the 5 words, and the step she had taken backward. She became aware of it more acutely than usual, the way a person becomes aware of their own heartbeat after running. Normally the device was background in, impartial witness, meant to protect her from disputes, to provide proof when her word alone was not enough. But now she wondered, proof of what? Proof that she had laughed at a man whose years outnumbered her own training. Proof that she had been silenced by 5 words spoken with neither threat nor anger. Walter seemed not to notice the camera, or if he did, he gave no weight to it. He continued, as he had all morning, adjusting the fold of his newspaper, steadying his cane against his knee, lifting the cooling coffee to his lips with both hands. The dog tag tapped lightly against his chest with each sip, a rhythm the body cam would record but never interpret. Inside the diner, the ledger rested closed on the counter. The waitress leaned on one elbow near the coffee pots, watching the pair across the street with quiet interest. The barber paused in his sweeping again, squinting toward the patrol car, as if trying to read the officer's posture from afar. Life in the town had not stopped, but it had slowed, as though the weight of 5 words had spread across the street like a shadow. The officer shifted, her eyes dropping to the small lens. She imagined the footage being downloaded later, her supervisors clicking through it. They would hear her laugh too sharp, too quickened, then his words, steady and final. They would watch her step back, not forced, not frightened, but moved. She wondered what line item such a moment would become in a report. Cameras captured facts, not meaning. Walter tapped his cane once, the sound cutting across her thoughts. She lifted her gaze. He was looking at her now, not with accusation, but with the same patience he had shown all morning. The kind of patience earned in trenches, in foxholes, in waiting for dawn that might not come. Everything in that box, he said, nodding faintly toward the body cam, is only half the story. The officer blinked, caught off guard again. She wanted to ask how he knew about the device, whether he had noticed its red blink, or simply understood how the world had changed since his youth. But she stayed quiet. Walter smoothed the newspaper again, the crease obedient beneath his hand. A picture, a film, a machine. He continued, voice even. They'll keep what you see. They'll never keep what it meant. His words were not an argument, not even a lecture. They were an observation, laid down with the same steadiness as the rest of his morning. The officer looked at the lens once more, its tiny light pulsing as if to insist it was listening. Yet she felt, for the first time, that the machine was deaf. A bus groaned to a stop at the corner. A woman stepped down with a child in hand, both of them hurrying toward the market. Walter nodded in greeting as they passed, the gesture small but respectful. The child waved back without prompting, a quick flick of fingers that carried more recognition than the camera ever could. The officer let her arms fall at her sides. She felt the urge to reach up, to press the button that would stop the recording. But protocol held her hand still. The camera must run, must record, must file away the day in unfeeling memory. Walter leaned back. Kane angled just so, and let the silence return. The officer shifted again, this time not backward, not forward, but into stillness beside the patrol car. The lens blinked, faithful, uncomprehending. The body cam would keep its footage, the town would keep its meaning. The diner's doorbell chimed again, the sound soft but steady, like a reminder that days continue whether people are ready for them or not. Inside, the owner reopened his ledger, the thick spine creaking in a way that matched the town's rhythm. He did not flip far. The page was already waiting for him. With his pen balanced between two fingers, he drew a line beneath the morning's first entry graffiti, paid forward and began a new one. He wrote carefully, bench veteran words remembered. It was not an account that would mean anything to a tax collector, not a figure that could be calculated at the end of the month. But the diner's ledger had always carried more than transactions. It carried moments, quiet notations that held the shape of the town's memory. The waitress glanced over his shoulder, reading the line without asking what it meant. She nodded once, as though confirming to herself that the book had captured something important. Then she carried a pot to refill cups, her steps measured, her face thoughtful. Across the street, Walter remained on the bench, one hand resting on his folded newspaper. The officer leaned against the patrol car, body cam blinking. Ticket book, long forgotten. The words he had spoken still traveled in the air, softer now, but not gone. They had settled into places where silence usually lived, like the ledger's lines waiting for ink. The barber stopped his sweeping and came to his doorway. Broom braced against his palm. He studied the pair across the street, then shook his head slowly, as if he too were writing something down, an entry in memory rather than paper. People in this town did not need ledgers to remind them of certain days. Still, the diner's book would keep it, just as Walter kept his folded crease in the newspaper. Inside the diner, a truck driver at the counter asked the owner what was written. The owner did not read it aloud. He simply tapped the page with one finger and said, "It's covered." The driver nodded, as if the phrase explained everything. In small towns, covered could mean a bill was paid, a debt was settled, or a story had been marked without needing to be retold. Walter shifted his cane, the hollow tap against the pavement, carrying easily into the diner's open window. The waitress paused, pen hovering above a check, listening without appearing to. She thought of her own grandfather, his medals tucked in a box in her mother's closet, never spoken of at family gatherings. The officer let her arms rest loosely at her sides, but her gaze kept flicking toward the diner's window, where she saw the faint outline of the ledger open on the counter. She didn't know why her eyes went there, only that the book seemed to echo what Walter had said. Some records kept more than numbers. She wondered what line her own name might receive if she ever crossed that counter, if her laugh or her retreat would be given ink. A delivery boy entered the diner with a crate of milk, nodding to the owner, who lifted the ledger just far enough off the counter to make space. The crate thumped down. The book returned to its place, unbound. Life and record coexisted, one shaping the other. Walter reached for his coffee again, though the steam had thinned to nothing. He drank it with the same care as before. The officer straightened her stance slightly, not as defense, but as acknowledgement. The body cam blinked, unable to register any of it beyond sound and image. In the diner, the owner closed the ledger with a soft thud. The line he had written would not be read aloud again today, but it would remain, pressed into the paper. Long after the officer left, long after Walter folded his paper and carried his cane home, the book would still remember. Bench veteran words remembered. Outside, the town's rhythm resumed. Cars passed, pigeons shuffled. The bus sighed at the corner, yet something uncounted had been added to the day. The ledger had it now, in ink, and the street carried it in silence. By late afternoon, the sky had paled, clouds thinning to a washed gray that softened the light across the street. The bench outside the post office still held Walter. Kane leaned against his knee, paper folded with its loyal crease. The officer had not left either. She stood near the patrol car, posture less rigid than before, as though the hours had worn down her edges. The body cam blinked on, silent but faithful, a machine storing more than it could ever interpret. Slowly, the town seemed to gather, not in rows, not in ceremony, but in the way people drift toward a story without being told. The barber stepped out of his shop entirely, broom still in hand, leaning on it as though it were a staff. From the diner, two customers exited with coffee in paper cups, pausing at the curb to glance toward the bench before continuing slowly, as if reluctant to leave the orbit of what was happening. The post office door opened with its squeak, and a clerk stepped out to sweep the steps. She lingered halfway through the task, broom idle, eyes on Walter. She had seen him before. Of course everyone in town had, but today he was more than an old man with a folded paper. Today he was the center of a silence that demanded respect. The officer shifted, sensing the weight of eyes that weren't directed at her, but at the space she occupied beside him. She was not sure if the crowd judged her, or if they were simply waiting to see what would come next. Either way, her badge felt heavier than usual. Though no one had spoken against her, Walter seemed unaware of the gathering, or perhaps he had expected it. He adjusted his wool cap, smoothed the crease in his paper once more, and tapped his cane lightly against the pavement. The sound carried farther than it should have, catching the attention of those across the street. A man leaving the hardware store stopped mid-step, glanced over, then remained still, hammer in his hand as though a tool might serve as witness. Inside the diner, the owner opened his ledger again, not to write, but to rest his hand on the page he had already marked. The waitress, pouring coffee into a customer's mug, tilted her head toward the window, her motion unhurried. Even the jukebox in the corner, usually restless with old songs, seemed quieter, as though the room itself preferred to listen. The officer cleared her throat softly. She did not speak, but the sound broke the spell long enough for her to remember the body cam still blinked. She thought of supervisors again, of the footage being reviewed. Would they see a crowd forming around a man on a bench? Would they note her silence as failure, or would they sense, even through the screen, that she was learning something training had not prepared her for? Walter lifted his coffee cup, tilting it slightly to catch the last of its contents. Then he held it steady, both hands around it, and looked across the street at no one in particular. His gaze brushed the diner, the barber, the hardware man, the clerk on the steps, the officer at the car. It was a look wide enough to gather them all without needing to name them. No one spoke, but the silence felt like language. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking something too soft to carry. She shook her head and hushed him, eyes never leaving the bench. The officer finally shifted forward, one step, then stopped herself. It was not time to close the distance. She folded her hands loosely in front of her belt, the gesture awkward but genuine. The crowd did not move closer, but they stayed, as if distance itself were a kind of respect. But Walter set the empty cup beside his paper. The cane tapped once more. Around him, the quiet crowd breathed as one, not commanded, not assembled, but gathered by the gravity of an old man's presence. The light shifted further toward evening, softer now, brushing long shadows across the sidewalk. Walter sat as he had all day, his cap shading his brow, his folded paper keeping its crease as if trained to obey. The empty cup rested at his side, steam long vanished, only the faint smell of coffee lingering like a reminder. His cane leaned steady against his knee, a prop that seemed more like a companion than a tool. The quiet crowd remained nearby, barber at his doorway, clerk at the post office steps, customers with half-finished coffee on the curb. No one had announced themselves as audience, but all had become one. They did not form a circle, did not intrude. They hovered at the edge of the moment, content to let the silence stretch. Walter reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate care, as though each movement carried weight. From within he drew a small envelope, its edges softened by years, corners bent into memory. He tapped it once against his knee, then slid out a photograph. The paper had yellowed faintly, but the image was sharp enough. A line of young men, uniforms loose on shoulders still narrow, helmets too large, faces too certain and too uncertain at once. He held it loosely, angled toward the officer though she had not asked to see. The bodycam caught the rectangle of faded gloss, its lens unblinking, but no machine could know what the photograph meant. The officer leaned slightly forward, careful not to crowd him, her eyes narrowing to focus. "They said we'd be home by Christmas," Walter murmured, voice low, steady. "We weren't." The barber lowered his broom, holding it upright like a flagpole. The clerk's hand stilled on her broom at the steps. Inside the diner, the waitress poured too much coffee into a mug, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim before she caught herself. Walter traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, not looking at it, but at the officer's face. "Half these boys never saw 21. His words fell into the air without demand, without tremor. They simply existed, like stones set carefully into place. The officer swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She wanted to speak, but found no words that would not sound thin beside his. She glanced again at the body cam, its red blink recording image and sound without comprehension. She realized she was not the audience meant for this photograph. She was only the keeper of its echo. Walter slid the picture back into the envelope, then back into his jacket, folding the moment away as if to remind himself it could rest again. His cane tapped softly against the ground, a period at the end of his sentence. The crowd shifted, subtle but perceptible. A man from the hardware store removed his cap and held it against his chest. A mother near the market drew her child closer, whispering something that made the boy look at the bench with wide eyes. No one applauded. No one intruded. They simply bore witness. The officer stepped back another inch, not in retreat but in deference. She felt the photograph linger in the space between them, more powerful than any badge or uniform. She thought of Huron training manuals, filled with diagrams and procedures. None of them had prepared her for a moment like this, where authority meant listening, where respect meant silence. Walter rested both hands on the head of his cane, leaning into it gently. He looked down the street as though watching for a bus that would never come. His eyes did not shine, but they carried the weight of memory too deep for water. The photograph remained unseen by most, but the moment it represented had become part of the street. The crowd breathed as one, and the day, already leaning toward dusk, seemed to pause out of courtesy. Evening pressed itself gently across the town, soft and deliberate. The street lamps had not yet flickered alive, but their glass globes held a faint readiness, as if waiting for a cue. Shadows lengthened over the post office steps, over the diner's window where the ledger lay closed, over the barber's doorway where the broom leaned as a witness. Through it all, the bench remained the anchor. Wooden slats worn smooth by decades of use, iron arms steady despite rust creeping along their curves. Walter sat in its center, his folded paper on his lap, his cane angled in quiet loyalty. The officer lingered near the patrol car, her shoulders squared but softer now, her breath not measured by authority but by awareness. The body cam's red blink continued, but she no longer thought of it as shield or proof. It was simply there, recording a scene it could not interpret. A bench, an old man, a town holding itself still. A boy on a scooter paused at the curb, one sneaker planted on the ground. He looked at Walter with curiosity, and at the officer with hesitation. The boy's mother caught up, touched his shoulder, and urged him on. Yet he kept glancing back, as though he sensed the bench was carrying more than a man. It was carrying something that mattered. Walter adjusted his wool cap, the gesture small but deliberate, as though he was saluting the day as it lowered itself. His eyes did not search the crowd. They rested on the horizon beyond the buildings, a distance no one else could see. He tapped his cane once, twice, and the sound settled into the pavement like a heartbeat. The barber crossed the street at last, broom still in hand. He did not approach the bench fully. He stopped halfway, leaning on the broom, as if it were a staff. "Evening, Walt," he said quietly, voice low enough to be almost private. Though the crowd nearby heard, Walter tipped his head, not needing more. The barber lingered, then returned slowly to his doorway. The brief crossing had been less about words, and more about showing presence. Inside the diner, the waitress dimmed the overhead lights, her reflection faint in the glass. She looked toward the ledger, then toward the bench, then back again, as if deciding which record mattered more. A couple at the counter followed her gaze. Silent in their coffee steamed at the officer took a step closer to the bench, but stopped before the distance closed. She did not want to disturb its gravity. She looked at Walter, at the way his shoulders carried the years without sagging, at the dog tag that glinted against his shirt like a stubborn star. She thought of the photograph he had shown, of the 5 words he had spoken, of the silence that had made her step back. The bench, she realized, had held all of it. Walter shifted the paper slightly, smoothing the crease again. "This bench is older than you think," he said finally, voice calm. The officer blinked, caught by the unexpected remark. He did not elaborate, but the weight of the sentence was clear. Benches, like men, carried more history than appearances revealed. The crowd seemed to lean closer, though no one moved. The officer opened her mouth, closed it again. Words felt clumsy. Respect, she realized, sometimes meant saying nothing. A breeze lifted, carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere unseen, the faint echo of a church bell 2 blocks away, the sharper scent of coffee grounds from the diner. The day was folding itself into evening, but the bench held steady. It held Walter. It held the officer's silence. It held the crowd's attention. And it held the unspoken understanding that some moments are too large for noise. When the first street lamp flickered on, the bench did not move. It remained what it had always been, a place for waiting, for resting, for remembering. And now, for the town, it had become a place of witness. Walter tapped his cane once more, and the sound declared that the bench would hold for as long as it needed to. The sun slipped lower, washing the storefronts in long strokes of amber and gray. The town moved more slowly now, as if the day itself had grown weary and wanted to rest beside Walter on the bench. The barber's sign creaked gently in the new breeze. The diner's bell rang less often, though its windows still glowed warm, showing the ledger resting shut on the counter like a book that had finished its chapter. Walter remained steady, cane angled against his knee, paper folded with the familiar crease. His wool cap sat square on his head, its shadow soft across his lined face. The dog tag at his collar caught what little light was left, gleaming faintly with each slow breath. Around him, the town did not disperse. The quiet crowd lingered, the barber leaning on his broom, the clerk on the steps with her sweeping long forgotten, the hardware man still cap in hand. Even children, usually restless at this hour, held closer to their parents. Sensing without being told that stillness mattered, the officer had not moved far from the patrol car. The body cam still blinked, dutiful but blind to the meaning of what it recorded. Her posture had shifted, less squared, more human. She kept her arms loose at her sides, as though prepared not for enforcement, but for listening. The red light at her chest marked the moment mechanically. Yet she felt the moment mark her in ways no machine could. A bus hissed at the corner, brakes sighing as passengers stepped down. One older man paused at the curb, looked toward the bench, and touched 2 fingers briefly to his brow in salute before continuing his walk. Walter returned the gesture with the smallest nod. The exchange was quiet, nearly invisible, but it rippled through the watching crowd like a stone in still water. Evening colors deepened. The sky above the post office shifted from pale blue to lavender, then to a muted rose along the horizon. Shadows stretched across the pavement, merging at the bench, as though the day's hours themselves were gathering around Walter. The officer felt it too, the sense that the ordinary street had become something more, a place heavy with memory, but carried lightly by one man's presence. Walter lifted his coffee cup one last time. Though it was empty, he held it anyway, both hands steady, as if toasting the evening itself. Then he set it back down, the hollow sound against the bench slats, marking the close of the day's ritual. The officer took a half step closer, careful, her boots quiet against the pavement. She did not speak. Walter glanced at her, eyes calm, and then back to the horizon. The silence between them was not uncomfortable anymore. It was shared, like a blanket laid across a chill. From the diner came the sound of cutlery being gathered, plates stacked. The waitress glanced out once more, her gaze soft. The barber finally set his broom inside the door, but kept himself in the doorway, unwilling to leave the view. The town's rhythm had slowed to match the man on the bench. As the first street lamps glowed fully to life, Walter leaned slightly forward, resting both hands on his cane. His voice, when it came, was almost part of the dusk. "Colors change," he said simply, "but some things stay." The officer felt the words land, not as lecture, but as fact. As dependable as the lamp's steady glow, as sure as the bench beneath him. She looked up at the sky, then back at him, and for once she did not think of reports, procedures, or cameras. She thought only of the quiet truth that the town had gathered to learn. That evening carried memory, and Walter still carried both. The day lowered itself completely, and the street kept its silence. The sky had given itself over to night, deepening from lavender to navy, until the first stars pressed through. The street lamps hummed faintly, their glow soft across the pavement. The diner's lights remained warm but dimmed, the ledger now shut tight for the day. The barber's broom leaned against the frame of his door, his shop closed but his presence still nearby. The post office steps were empty of mail sacks, only the clerk lingering at the top, as if reluctant to turn the key. That Walter shifted at last. The kind of small movement that signaled not restlessness, but completion. He folded the paper once more along its crease, slipped it beneath his arm, and reached for his cane. The crowd noticed the barber, the clerk, the waitress in the diner's window. Even the officer, leaning against her patrol car, straightened slightly. The old man's intent was clear. The bench had held long enough. He pressed the cane against the pavement, steadying himself. The motion was slow, deliberate, but carried no weakness. It was simply the pace of 93 years, a rhythm that asked no pardon. He rose, shoulders back, cap firm. The dog tag at his chest swung once, catching the street lamp's glow like a final salute to the day. The officer took an instinctive step forward, as though ready to offer her arm. Walter glanced at her, a look brief but firm enough to still her. He did not require assistance. He required only space. She stepped back again, not out of dismissal but respect, and let him set his own course. The barber lifted a hand in farewell. Walter returned it with a small nod, the gesture containing decades of shared mornings and trimmed hair. The clerk on the steps lowered her broom in quiet salute. Walter's cane tapped once more, a hollow sound that seemed to echo longer than the sidewalk allowed. The officer followed at a slight distance, not escorting, not commanding, but keeping pace just enough to mark the road. She felt the body cam still blinking, recording the walk, but she knew the device would not capture the meaning of each step. Cameras measured distance and time. They did not know reverence. Walter's stride carried him past the market, where the florist had pulled in the last of her buckets. She watched him go, hands damp from stems, and whispered a simple good night. He lifted his cane slightly in reply without breaking pace. The gesture looked small, but the weight of it carried Dot at the corner. The bus hissed again, brakes sighing, doors opening for no passengers. The driver leaned out, recognized Walter, and offered a nod as if to say, "Not tonight, but I see you." Walter lifted 2 fingers from his cane's handle. The bus pulled away. The officer walked half a block behind, hands loose at her sides, her ticket book forgotten. She no longer felt the need to fill silence with words or laughter. The day had written enough. She was only there to bear witness to the long walk home. Walter turned onto a narrower street where houses leaned close together, porches carrying the smell of suppers finished. The sound of televisions low behind curtains. A dog barked once, then quieted, as though recognizing him. The pavement gleamed faintly from an earlier rain. His cane tapped steady, his steps sure. Dot at his door. He paused. The officer slowed her pace, stopping before she reached him. He turned the key, pushed the door open, then looked once over his shoulder. Their eyes met under the weak light of the lamp. He did not speak again. He only inclined his head, the smallest bow, acknowledgement enough. The officer returned it, wordless. Walter stepped inside, the door shutting softly behind him. The bench down the street sat empty now, yet the town still seemed to hold his presence. The officer stood a while longer, then walked back toward her car, her boots quiet against the pavement. The night kept its silence, carrying the memory of 5 words, a bench, and a walk that would outlast reports, cameras, and ledgers.